welcome to the last in our series on complementary and alternative medicine. It's just been a pleasure. Having done a lot of teaching, mostly of half-asleep medical students, I want to tell you that sitting in the front row here all these weeks and feeling the interest has just been a joy for our lecturers. Dr. Prathakanti, when I saw her after her lecture last week, she was like glowing because she said just to have this much appreciation and this much interaction. So I'm very grateful for your showing up, your interest, your curiosity, and the fact that you're not falling asleep at 7 o'clock at night. So it's my pleasure today. I'm not going to introduce myself formally. There's something written in the thing that you can find out about me, but let's get started, because I titled this talk Herbal Medicine 101, What Every Consumer Needs to Know. And I want to up front say I have absolutely nothing to do with any pharmaceutical company, any herbal medicine company. No, it's important because there'll be some times tonight when I'm actually going to give you specific brands, which is something I would never do. But you're going to understand why in these first couple of slides I would even go to that extreme because of the quality issues. But let's get started. So I'm going to start a little bit with the overview that we probably would have done at the beginning of the lecture series, but the scheduling worked out that this was my slot. So I'm going to talk certainly mostly about herbs, but we'll start a little bit about the whole field of complementary and alternative medicine. And one of the most important things I hope you leave tonight's lecture with is an understanding of how herbs and supplements are regulated, and which of the top, we're going to focus on probably about 7 of the top 10 selling herbs. And are they safe? Is there evidence that they work? And mostly, because this is such a rapidly changing field, some resources at the end so that you can keep up. And I can tell you as a clinician, it's equally challenging for us because patients are coming in unbelievably well informed, bringing us reams of things from the internet. And it's both a joy for me and a challenge because this is a field that is just constantly changing. So by the time you buy a textbook, the material is pretty much out of date. So I will talk to you about some resources that are web-based at the end of the lecture. So let's talk a little bit about how the very diverse range of things that we call complementary and alternative medicine have sort of been categorized by our National Institutes of Health. And if you think of this, the whole circle as being representative of a whole medical system, and examples of that would be Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, Western biomedicine. Within these whole medical systems, there are often components of each of these 4. Biologically based practices would be things like drugs, herbs, and supplements, and so that we're going to be focusing on this quadrant today or tonight. Mind-body medicine we already presented with Dr. Kevin Barrows, and in some cases spirituality would be included in this mind-body category. What we haven't focused on in this lecture series are manipulative and body-based practices. Those would be things like chiropractic, osteopathic manipulation, massage. Great data for the efficacy of some of those. And finally, this last quadrant is called energy medicine, and it's sort of by the NIH type people a little bit of what they call frontier medicine. And this is a medicine that is believed based on the fact that some people believe that there is a sort of a bioenergetic field around a human being or an animal, and that you can affect their health by interacting with that field. Examples of, any of you heard of Reiki or therapeutic touch? Those would be things, or external Qigong, those would be things that would come in this area. So there was a huge survey done in 2002, and it was part of the National Health Interview Survey of more than 30,000 U.S. adults. And what made this survey so remarkable was that a face-to-face interview. It wasn't a phone interview. It wasn't a written thing. They sat down with patients and asked them a whole series of questions. And for the very first time in this large CDC-run survey, they actually included some questions about alternative medicine. Now, interestingly, they included prayer specifically for healthcare reasons. And as we heard from Dr. Rabo in the spirituality lecture, not surprising actually, prayer for one's own health and prayer on the behalf of others were the 2 most commonly listed. But here in 3rd place is the natural products that we're going to be focusing on. And that's probably the area that I get the most questions on in my practice. And this was a more updated survey done just this last year, and this was of about 1,600 people over the age of 50. It was jointly done by the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine and ARP, and in this case, the percentages of use were even higher. 45% use some form of body work, and look at this, almost 42% use some form of herb or dietary supplement. So as we age, apparently, these things become more attractive to us. Now, these next 3 slides are not in your handout because they inadvertently got deleted, so just enjoy the information. I love this. What worries me is that we're now becoming the alternative medicine. And that's because when, in 1992, David Eisenberg at Harvard published this very simple survey in the New England Journal, a very prestigious medical journal, and it showed at the time that about 1/3 of U.S. adults were using some form of alternative medicine. And the regular, conventional world just went, what? It was very surprising. Well, now the figures, depending upon whom you speak with, are anything from 40 to 60%. Probably the Bay Area is the hot spot in the country. So, and you know, when I had to write a grant to develop curriculum in this area, I just went to tell them what the environment was. I went to the Yellow Pages and I counted the number of listed massage therapists, acupuncturists, and chiropractors within a 2-mile radius of UCSF, and it was in the hundreds. So we are in a culturally diverse and rich area that is filled with people with great skill who practice these modalities. So it is not surprising to me that these figures may even be higher in the Bay Area. And it's a big business. Even back in 1997, in that Eisenberg survey, it was estimated that people spent between $27 and $30 billion, and most of it out of pocket. I'm curious, how many of you have health insurance that allows you to get services such as chiropractic or acupuncture? Are any of you aware of that? So some. Most of us, however, most patients who use these services end up paying out of pocket. And who are these people? Well, it's pretty obvious that many of them are drawn to alternative medicine. But the biggest single predictor of somebody seeking these therapies out is somebody with a higher level of education. So I'm going to guess that there's probably a number of years of graduate school and college in this room. A good friend of mine, John Aston, asked these questions in the late 90s, and in his survey, people who were also drawn to this field had a sort of naturally holistic interest in their health, personal growth, and spirituality. And they had a problem that Western medicine maybe wasn't completely dealing with in the ways they wanted, sort of a chronic health problem such as pain. And they wanted to complement what they were using in their regular practitioner's office. And reasons are pretty often listed. Many people feel it's safer, more natural. They love the fact that many of these practitioners look at them as more of a whole person, not that liver disease, not just the diagnosis of diabetes. They love the emphasis on well-being and prevention, which unfortunately few Western practitioners spend as much time on. And this last one is really key for me. My CAM practitioner spends more time and treats me as a unique individual. When I graduated from residency in residency in 1987, I had an hour for a new patient appointment. When's the last time you had an hour for your new patient primary care appointment? Now it's down to 20 to 30 minutes, and that's the whole. It's the history, the physical, my writing the note. So you can imagine that that puts a little bit of pressure on the things that I would normally have had time to do when I first graduated. So many times if people go to alternative practitioners, they have at least an hour, sometimes even 90 minutes. And it's really wonderful to not feel rushed through a medical appointment. In this same ARP survey, the reasons that Americans over 50 gave was that they really, very similar to what we said earlier, to treat a specific health condition. They either had back pain, or they were feeling depressed, or they were getting colds frequently. So they really wanted to address a specific medical concern. But I love this interest in prevention. For overall wellness and to prevent illness were also very high percentages. I love this. The truth is, doctor, I've lost faith in Western medicine. Many people feel that not only is it a positive draw towards integrative medicine, but it's a move away from what I've been trained to practice. And the truth is, dissatisfaction with conventional medicine is not an independent predictor. And only about 5% of patients exclusively use these therapies and avoid conventional care. And the overwhelming majority of us seek care from our conventional practitioners before we seek out the services of CAM practitioners. And this doesn't even address the herbs that we can just buy over the counter, not even needing to interact with somebody. So I love this too. Have you been messing around with alternative medicine, Mr. Wordle? And you would think that this did initiate a good conversation, but the truth is that conversation is not happening the majority of time. Patients are not telling me about their use of alternative therapies. And we'll go through a little bit about why that might be, but in most surveys, fewer than 40% of the therapies are disclosed to conventional practitioner. And now we include in our new patient questionnaire in the general medicine clinic, herbs, supplements, etc. Well, they did a study at the Mayo Clinic where they had the same stuff on the new patient workup, and the person's waiting for their provider, and a sweet medical student comes and sits down and says, well, I'd like to go over your questionnaire with you. Now, I see here it says you're not taking any herbs or supplements. So that means you're not taking any echinacea or St. John's wort. Oops. 50% underreporting, even when it's on the questionnaire. So it's really, what they didn't ask in this survey was, well, why didn't you write it down? And I think part of it we're going to get to in the next couple of slides. In this ARP survey, the major reason that this didn't come up was, guess what? The doctor never asked. And in his or her defense, there is so much to cover in the short period of time that this is not risen to the top of the most important history questions. This is kind of interesting. Didn't even know I should. And I think people assume that what they're doing for their health that's on the side isn't really relevant to what they're getting in their conventional care. Not enough time, clearly, didn't think the doctor would know anything. That's probably truer than not. And then this last one, this is almost always what physicians will answer. They're afraid that patients will feel that they'll be dismissive or tell me not to. And I think that's true in some cases, but not as true. It's not as often the case as sometimes patients worry about. So how do most of us find out about this rapidly growing field? Well, like we find out about regular medicine, it's mostly asking family and friends. And certainly now that the internet is available, the huge numbers of resources, some of them very good quality and some of them awful. Reading magazines, infomercials, and I'm not laughing about asking the health food clerk. When they have done studies where they've sent dummy patients, people who were trained to pretend they were patients, into health food stores and ask, say, I have HIV disease, what would you recommend? And the amount, these people, poor people, are not trained in medicine. They're trained in what the products are. And it's astounding what some of the medical information that's given to patients. Fortunately, I think that has improved a lot over the last couple of years. But virtually nobody, even somebody in the field, does what we call evidence-based analysis of the medical literature. And part of that is that that's a special skill. It takes time. And the literature actually is not as good as we would hope, even though it's improving. So this sort of talks a little bit about what is the evidence. And the majority of research in this area prior to the 1990s was done in Europe, because this is much more popular in Europe. It's practiced greatly in Germany, England, and all of Europe. But in the early 1990s, a senator felt very strongly that he'd been helped with his health, with Senator Tom Harkin. So he asked Congress to appropriate some funds for what was at the time called the Office of Alternative Medicine. Then a number of years later, it was elevated to the status of a full center, and it's called NCAM, the Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. And although its budget is a small, small fraction of what the rest of NIH is, it does fund a large number of studies, including some in UCSF. And in fact, in looking on their website, they've now also funded 6 national centers for botanical medicine. So let's shift gears now that we've sort of done an overview of the general territory and start to focus on herbs. So traditionally, botanicals were really the pharmaceuticals that our ancestors had. And they've been used for thousands of years by virtually every culture. And in fact, for most of history, herbal medicines were all that our ancestors had to take care of their loved ones. And these traditional healers, there'd be a huge legacy. The healers before them would apprentice them. They would learn all about the local plants, how to grow them, when to harvest them, which parts were safe. And that lore and that information was passed on from generation to generation. And in fact, at the turn of the century, around 1890, I actually went over and checked out the library. There's Merck manuals and the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, and almost 60% of the medicines that were available at that time were actually just plant products. Now, this decreased a lot, and around 1940, obviously things like antibiotics were coming. They had already come into place in World War I. And in 1990, before the huge burst in herbal medicine that we've all experienced, fewer than 2% of the medicines listed in the Pharmacopoeia were herbs. Do any of you recognize this plant? We've got somebody over here. So she said foxglove. And do you have any sense why I put it on this slide? Aha! Ooh, we have an informed audience. So somebody said digitalis. So this was a plant that was discovered in the late 1700s by Dr. Worthington, that its leaves had a capacity to help the heart beat. And in fact, my mother, if she were alive today, would be 100 this year. And she was a remarkable woman because she went to medical school at a time when there were virtually no women. But to do that, she had to ask the permission of her father, and he would not let her go to med school until she became a pharmacist. So she was a pharmacist. This is an interesting, my grandpa was quite a man. So anyway, what she would tell me stories where she would get a prescription, 5 grams of digitalis, a foxglove leaf, and she would literally grind it up in that mortar and pestle, and that was what she had to offer her clients. So we've come a long way in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, but as you're going to see, about a quarter of the medicines, the prescription medicines that I actually write in my practice are plant-based. So we haven't gotten completely away from this, and that's why you keep hearing about trips to the Amazon to discover new, plants that might have some sort of an active ingredient that would be helpful in medicine. But nowadays, most of us, I would guess that most of you are not going and grinding up your foxglove leaves in the garden. And most of us are purchasing products at Whole Foods or at Walgreens or Long's or on the internet that come in capsules and in a bottle. And we're not consulting a lay or a trained herbalist. And on top of that, there's no licensing in the state of California for people who do have special training in herbal medicine. So I'm just going to insert this one slide because it's always a question I get in the context of how do you find a good practitioner. And the same way that you have a trouble finding out who's going to be the best orthopedic surgeon to replace mom's knee, how did you figure that out for your family? You ask other family members, you ask other patients, you ask your primary care doctor. So it's the same sort of thing. It's usually word of mouth reputation. We do have 4 classes of CAM practitioners that are licensed in the state of California. That simply means they have a regulatory board, they have to apply for it, and if they have these licenses, either an osteopathic doctor, a licensed acupuncturist, as Beverly Burns is, a chiropractor, or for the last 2 years in California now, naturopaths or NDs are licensed. Those you at least have the option of going to a website and having a regulatory board be able to give you some information about their training. Unfortunately, the ones that are not licensed in California are people trained in herbal medicine, unless they've got an ancillary medical degree or nursing degree, homeopaths or energy healers. So let's talk about dietary supplements. As I said, many of the prescription medications I write are actually derived from plants, and it's estimated that about almost half of us take some form of supplement. Now, granted, most of these are just multivitamins, but some of them are really more significant herbal or botanical products. And this was the huge burst. I don't know what happened, but in the mid to late 1990s, sales increased 80%. There were just huge blossoming in this market. And they've sort of leveled off a little, and I'm not sure whether that means people are a little bit more jaundiced, having heard of some of the quality issues, or why that is. But it's still growing, but at a less rapid rate. And this fact is something that's very important to me, and we're going to figure out why when I go and talked to you about St. John's wort. But 1 in 6 patients who are taking prescription medications are also taking supplements or herbs, more than one often. And again, because that conversation isn't happening, there's a little bit of a risk of there being some sort of an interaction which may or may not be helpful. On top of it, even though there are probably 20,000 herbal products available and marketed in our country, we really have, in terms of the Western gold standard randomized control trial evidence, for fewer than 30 of them. Now again, this is in contrast with, years, decades, centuries of traditional use. But I just want to say that if you're trying to hold these things to the same standard, there just wasn't the money, the quality research done on them that there is on many of the of what we know today as our pharmaceutical industry. And this is really interesting. So in one study, they said, okay, Dorla, you like your supplement X. Now, what if I told you that there was a huge clinical trial that said supplement X didn't work? 71% said, I don't care what the evidence is. It makes me feel good, and I'm going to continue to take it. And that's, I don't say that that's necessarily bad. It's, there's a huge power of placebo. There's a huge power in the healing of benefit. Who knows? You might have been the one in that clinical trial that did respond. But it's interesting. Evidence-based medicine doesn't always apply when you're taking something that you feel is helpful. So here's the list, and we don't have the data yet for 2006. So this was the latest I could get from the business journals that follow natural products. So these are the top 10 selling herbs in 2005, and we're going to touch briefly on garlic, a little bit more on echinacea, saw palmetto, ginkgo. I'm not going to have the time to do soy or cranberry, ginseng, black cohosh, St. John's wort, and milk thistle. And this is the general most popular use, and unfortunately you can see here there's not these small benefits are fine, but some of these that we thought were absolutely active and safe, some recent data just sort of says maybe not, or at least we need a little bit more information. So this is the single most important slide of my talk, and I'm sure many of you are aware of it, but for those of you who aren't, this is what has set the regulatory tone for these products, and why you and I can go to any pharmacy, any Walgreens, Longs, Whole Foods, Rainbow, and pick up a wide variety of these products. In 1994, this Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act was passed unanimously by Congress. And there's a little bit of a background story. Can you imagine the last time some bill was passed unanimously by Congress with the environment we're in now? So guess who was head of the FDA at that time? David Kessler, who's our dean. And he started to have some quality concerns because all of these products were available over the counter with virtually no regulation. So he started making some public statements about, well, maybe these things should be a little bit more regulated. Well, the public did not want their access eliminated, and the herbal medicine industry got together a letter writing campaign, and they wrote more letters to Congress about this single piece of legislation than they did about the entire Vietnam War. So this passed unanimously. And what it says is that all of these things we think of as herbs and supplements, minerals, amino acids, are seen as food or as nutritional supplements, not as medications. And as long as they don't claim to treat a specific disease, they can be marketed without any testing about whether they're safe or whether they work. So if we wanted to make the Ali Herbal Medicine Company, we could incorporate tonight. I could talk any of you who are gardeners to go and grab some green stuff from your garden. Somebody could do a nice label, and if we could market a product, we could convince a pharmacy to put our product on the shelf. The only way it would be taken off is if the FDA took us to court and proved it was unsafe. So it's much more a buyer beware market than it is for even things like aspirin and Tylenol, which are more regulated. Okay, so these are the things we can't be sure of. We don't know if the plant was accurately identified. I was saying before the lecture, sometimes plants look very similar, and unintentionally a toxic one is harvested instead of the benign one. And there was such a substitution a number of years ago that caused people to go on renal dialysis because it shot their kidneys. We don't know if the potency will be the same bottle to bottle. There have been a lot of studies where they bought up national leading brands of herbs, sent them to the lab for independent testing, and found out 6, 10, 12, 50-fold difference in the active ingredient. We don't know if the herb is pure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, safe or effective. Now, I'm painting a pretty scary picture here, and in truth, the quality in the industry has improved greatly in the last 5 years, but there are some caveats, so let me give you some further examples of what I call adulterated products. And some of the products that are imported from Asia are actually unintentionally found to have things like heavy metals, pesticides, and microbes. But there are some even that are intentionally adulterated. Our Poison Control Center is one of the best in the state, and they ended up, there's a class of medication which probably very few of you are taking, but they're called Chinese patent medicines. And they went to Chinatown, bought a number of these, sent them again to the lab for independent testing, and they had prescription medicines. Now, these were not misharvested. You don't find Valium trees, you know, next to the herb. So they had Valium, ibuprofen, they had steroids in them, and so it's amazing. So, and there's nothing about that on the label. And guess what's in herbal Viagra? Real Viagra. And you can buy this over the internet. Not all herbal, I mean, I don't know if all herbal is, but certainly the FDA found a couple that were. So I just want to say we'll be talking a little bit about adverse effects of herbs. And I just want to put this in perspective, because if somebody's taking an herb and then they develop a problem, and then how do you know whether or not the problem was due to the fact that they were taking the herb? And one example I'm going to give you is with ginkgo, which is this drug that's taken by many people to help their memory. Well, it has a little bit of has a little bit of what we call antiplatelet activity, which means that it's a little bit like a blood thinner. So there have been some case reports of bleeding, but when you look back, most of these patients were already taking aspirin and other drugs that could cause the bleeding. So you can't, it's really difficult to sometimes completely figure out, was it the herb and the supplement that was causing this or not? And in fact, again, association does not prove that they were causing it. And when carefully reviewed in one study, no more than about 1/5 of them were likely due to the herb that was implicated in the case report. What we don't have is a lot of prospective safety data, but I can tell you that Kaiser is doing just land-breaking work. They have all of their medicines, and they're obviously on a computer, and they're also now selling high-quality herbal products in their pharmacies. So they have a way to trace if somebody buys an herb and there's a red flag, one, that happens, but they also are able to then to follow long-term, was this person who bought the milk thistle, you know, in trouble 5 months later? And so they're going to have a much better time of answering these questions. So one more cartoon. I take echinacea 3 times a day. Well, I take it twice a day, and golden seal 4 times a day. Well, I take mine with elderberry tea. I take mine with ginger root tea and follow with zinc lozenges. Gosh, I have to take ginkgo to remember to take the ginseng. Herbs, the inner accessory. God, I'm so bummed out about being sick, I'm going to start taking St. John's wort. And we laugh about this, but I'm going to tell you the number of people in my practice who come in and say, I can't afford my antihypertensive medicine. And I said, well, why don't you bring all your supplements next week? And she brings in a shopping bag and pours it on the office. And by the time you add up, not only the chance for interactions, but the cost, one woman who really couldn't afford it was spending like $400 a month on supplements. So I'm not saying that's bad or good, but I'm just, this is definitely what we call polypharmacy. So that leads me into St. John's wort. And the reason I always start an herbal lecture about this is because this is an herb that works when it's used properly for the indication that it's meant for, but has a dark side, and that dark side is this potential to interact with medications. So let's go through it. Traditionally, as with almost all the modern use of herbs, what we use them for today is what our ancestors figured out they were good for. And this was for mood disorders, although it also was used topically for wounds and burns. And the current indicated use by most experts is mild to moderate depression. Not major, severe depression, but mild to moderate. And this slide sort of summarizes hundreds of clinical trials, but the take-home message is pretty impressive. St. John's wort, when you compare it to a sugar pill or a placebo, is a heck of a lot more effective for treating mild to moderate depression than the sugar pill. Okay, well, how does it stack up against all the medications that I write in my practice? Well, when they do head-to-head trials, it actually is almost as good as many of the prescription medications, even the ones that we use nowadays, the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac, Paxil, and Zoloft. And on top of that, given the side effect profile of many of those medications, it's got about half the side effects. So you're saying, whoa, wait a second, this works as well as anything that I'm writing a prescription for, is better tolerated. Why aren't we doing it more? Well, part of it's that it got fairly bad press with a couple of large recent trials where it showed that it really wasn't any better than a placebo and certainly not any better than some of the prescription medications. But when you look carefully and read the study, the patients were people with more severe symptoms of depression. And I think even traditional herbalists would say, ooh, no, that's not the right population. So just to say, the NIH has figured this out, and there now is a trial in progress for people with milder forms of depression that are comparing it to one of the SSRIs. So is it safe? Well, it's really been well tolerated in clinical trials. Like with many other herbs, the side effects are pretty mild. Mild headache, GI upset, a little dizziness, fatigue. This restlessness is important. A little bit of allergy. This is something that's a little bit unique to St. John's wort, a photosensitivity. So people that are taking it tend to sunburn more. And the way they figured it out was they noticed that cattle that were eating St. John's wort started to get sunburned ears. So don't know what the reason is, but so you definitely need. In fact, I had one patient of mine who's a really serious mountain climber and didn't get that warning, even though I had told him a couple of months earlier, went to a high altitude thing and came back completely, really almost third-degree burns because he had not he'd been still taking his St. John's wort. But this is the smoking gun I'm talking about, why I think it's not used more, and that's because of this potential for an interaction. So let me tell you, this was an incredibly simple study. This was not an expensive study, but it was published in a great journal, Lancet, in the year 2000. So what they did is they got 8 healthy volunteers, probably med students, and they had them take an HIV drug called Endinavir for 3 days, and they checked their blood levels. So that was this thing. Stop the Endinavir, start St. John's wort for the next 2 weeks, restart the Endinavir, same 3-day set of dose, and check the blood levels. Well, look what happened. 57% reduction in what we call the area under the curve. There's no way these patients would know it, feel it, and they'd really be at risk because they would be subtherapeutic on a life-saving medication. So why did this happen? Same journal, there was a report of 3 cardiac transplant patients taking the drugs you have to prevent rejection, and one of those is cyclosporin. So they came into practice after being on cyclosporin for years, and they're in subacute rejection. And the transplant people are going, what happened? Did you forget your cyclosporin? No. Well, I started taking St. John's wort, and when they plotted their cyclosporin levels, they were like this. They started St. John's wort, cyclosporin levels plummeted, stopped St. John's wort, cyclosporin levels came back up. So what they were able to figure out was that St. John's wort actually revs up one system in the liver that helps metabolize these important medications. So it's like speeding up the metabolism so there's less of the drug available. And in fact, the system in the liver that St. John's wort happens to speed up is responsible for metabolizing half of the prescription drugs I write in my practice. So you're going, woo, this isn't very good. So what are some of the other drugs? Oh, I didn't. So some of the other drugs that St. John's wort can lower the level of by a slightly different mechanism, the digoxin, some forms of estrogen, the cyclosporin. So organ transplant people should not be taking St. John's wort unless they're very carefully getting their levels checked, and a variety of other medications. So this is clearly something that's quite significant given the number of people who combine herbs when they're taking prescription medications. So wait, let me go back. Okay. So to just summarize, here's an herb that looks really good in terms of efficacy and in general is well tolerated in clinical trials, but has this dark side to me of interacting with medications and potentially lowering their levels. And on top of it, it really needs to be used in the right population. It's not for somebody who's really, really depressed. You should, that's not an appropriate place for this drug, this herb. We don't have, because clinical trials are so expensive to run, we don't really have long-term safety and efficacy trials. And again, this is the hardest thing, the fact that it may lower the levels. And we can't monitor the drug levels of most of the prescription medicines we give. Some of them we can, but many of them we can't. So I'm going to shift gears to ginkgo, which I mentioned sort of a little bit earlier. It's probably the herb with the longest history in terms of written medical use, and that's because it's used in traditional Chinese medicine as well as now in more modern times. There are records of it being used for over 2,000 years ago. It's the fourth most commonly used herb, and there are really quite a number of studies using it primarily for memory and dementia. But I think of it, and this is a super simplification, so I apologize, but I think of it as kind of a mild herbal blood thinner. So there are some people with blocked arteries to their legs, and they've actually studied it in those patients and found that they can walk further when they take the ginkgo. But we're going to focus mostly on the memory part of it. So the other mechanisms that are believed to take place with ginkgo, and it's not just the blood thinning part of it, the anticoagulant part, but it also seems to relax blood vessels a little bit. So if you're thinking of things that are going to help feed your brain and get more good things, more blood flow, more nutrients to the brain, that would be helpful. It also seems to increase the level of neurotransmitters in parts of the brain, but particularly the memory center. And it seems to even, on top of everything, have an antioxidant activity. So these are four nice things that you would want for somebody to maintain their memory. And to summarize, without going into the details, it does seem to be more effective than a sugar pill or a placebo in delaying the inevitable cognitive decline that we see in people with established dementia. There was a year-long trial that was very impressive with ginkgo versus placebo, and in truth, there was a little bit of improvement or stabilization, but it didn't mean that Aunt Mary's going to get up and start reciting Shakespeare. Because most of the time when you looked at the control group, the cognition just continues to drop. In the ginkgo group, some people actually improved, but most of the people just stabilized. But the difference was, statistically significant, and in some patients clinically significant. Now, I almost always get questions from my non-demented patients, like one of them was the granddaughter of one of my patients, and she says, Papa's taken this stuff for his memory, and he seems pretty sharp, and I've got my English final at San Francisco State. Is this going to help me? There haven't been very many clinical trials of people who have normal memory, but there have been some ones where they've given them really huge doses and very short-term memory improvements happen. But this is not a good option for healthy people. At least we don't have the information. Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you. So he's asking, what's the difference between statistically significant and clinically significant? So statistically, when you read a research study, you want to make sure that the differences between the two groups are not due to chance. So there's a bit of number crunching, that if, let's say, you had a trial of 7,000 people, the larger the trial, the easier it is to show something's going to be different. So let's say it's statistically significant, but in terms of whether or not your relative who's taking this is going to look individually like he or she is now waking up and alert, it may not be clinically significant. And unfortunately, most of the time, studies are always just based on, statistical significance. But that's, does that answer your question? Great. Okay. So let's talk about safety, because I already sort of mentioned about these bleeding case reports. But truthfully, in large clinical trials, there haven't been an increased number of bleeding episodes. But Steve Bent, who's associated with the Osher Center and a great researcher who did the seminal Saul Palmetto study I'm going to talk about in a second, reviewed all of the case reports in up to 2005, and there were 15 in the literature. And it's really hard, again, to prove that association is causal, but there was at least one case where, and sure enough, it was a physician, stubborn physician who was taking it, felt it was helping. Okay, he bled, not into his brain, which was not good. So of course stopped, and then he was having bleeding in his gums, and then started to get better, and about 2 years later just really wanted to try it again and bled again. So this was kind of like, this is not an experiment you'd want if it were your dad. And so that might be more indication that indeed the ginkgo was responsible for his bleeding, but most of the time we don't put patients through that. But that said, a lot of surgeons and anesthesiologists across the board kind of say, and if any of you have had elective surgery recently, I wouldn't be surprised if they asked you, what supplements are you taking, and would you stop some of these things 2 weeks before surgery? Now, it's not very evidence-based, but they at least don't want the ginkgo in your system and some of the others that are associated with increased risks of bleeding. So this is actually a very important question that finally NIH has put a fair amount of money into. So it's not just, yes, it's important to treat the patients who are already demented, but if you take it, let's say you're 70 and you're forgetting where your keys are, if you start taking ginkgo, is that going to make life better for you? Is it going to prevent dementia or at least delay it? And this is a prospective, meaning that they're starting at time zero and they're going to follow all these elderly patients, 75 years or older, for 5 years, which is an unheard of period of time in terms of expense. And they're going to randomize them, so the patients will not know are they getting the ginkgo or placebo. And on regular intervals, they're going to do memory tests. So they're going to be able to tell, and it had to be this large a trial because memory loss doesn't happen overnight, so it'll be very interesting. We probably won't get results until 2010, but this is the kind of trial that will answer a really important question. Any questions about ginkgo? Yeah, it's hard to say, because nobody's spending money to compare like ginkgo and head-to-head with aspirin. Even though it has all those other positive mechanisms of action that are hypothesized. But guess who are the people who are taking ginkgo for their memory? They're the people who are already taking the baby aspirin to protect their hearts. So it's a little bit, it's always a question when somebody comes in and says, I'm on my baby aspirin and here I want to take some ginkgo, and I just have to give them the theoretical concern about that. So let's move on to black cohosh. Most of you know that, well, maybe some of you do. Most of us in this room are probably, there's some young'uns here, but I tried to include herbs that would be of interest to some of us who are a little bit on the other side of 50. And this is an herb that has been used for centuries by Native Americans. It's native, it grows in the United States, and it's been used sort of as a tonic for women's conditions. And now it's most exclusively or most commonly used to help with hot flashes. And many of you are aware that when the results of that large Women's Health Initiative study came out about the risks of hormone, that 1 week I got 35 phone calls from women who had cold turkey stopped their Prem-Pro and were miserable with the hot flashes coming back. So black cohosh sales went way up as a result of this women's study. So most of the research has been conducted in Europe on two, and this is where I'm going to give you a brand name. No relationship, no free samples, no nothing. Okay. So Remifemin is probably the most familiar one, and I'm going to say truthfully, a lot of the original early research on this was sponsored by the manufacturer. So you always have to look back and say, was this a well-designed study? Because the drug company or the the herb company was the one paying for it. And the second one is a slightly newer but very high-quality preparation. The problem is we don't really know what the mechanism of action is. We don't know really what the active ingredients are, although it is standardized to a certain compound. But early clinical trials, especially in Europe, showed that it seemed to be better than the sugar pill for relieving hot flashes. And the patient population that really is interested are my women breast cancer survivor patients who can't take estrogen and are miserable with their hot flashes, or sometimes taking tamoxifen, which makes the hot flashes worse. And so it has been studied in breast cancer survivors, and actually it's a little bit more mixed than this would indicate. Of the 6 randomized control trial, there were a couple of others where they just did it in a different way, and these open trials mean that the patients know they're getting the medication. And these authors concluded that in most studies it looked like it was better than placebo. So the biggest question, to women like this is it going to have any estrogenic activity? Because if it's helping hot flashes and estrogen's the best treatment for hot flashes, is this what's going on? And it doesn't look like it. But we still don't know why it works, but it doesn't look like it's through an estrogen mechanism, because it doesn't appear to bind estrogen receptors in the test tube, upregulate these genes, or stimulate the growth of estrogen-dependent tumors in animal models. So there's a lot of research being done about why it would be effective for hot flashes, but it doesn't appear to be operating through estrogen. So just to make the waters a little murkier, black cohosh is often used in a combination product. So if you think we're going to do a randomized control trial and you've got a product with multiple ingredients, you're not going to know, except the combination, whether or not it works. And this is an example of why people go nuts in reading the literature, because in one year, last year, there were 2 trials, and they both studied slightly different multi-herbal combinations, and they came to totally different conclusions. So let me just show you what the 2 studies were. The smaller study was one of 80 women, and it only lasted for 3 months, which is actually not as long as you would like. And this was a combination product with some soy phytoestrogens, and they compared that with women who were just taking calcium, which we should all be taking for our bones. And there were fewer hot flashes in the treatment group. Okay, that's great. But this was a much more, a larger, much more complicated 1-year-long trial that showed no difference. But let me just show you. So women came into the trial, the 350 of them, and they either got randomized to a placebo, to hormone therapy, okay, because we know from all those years of women taking hormones, that's probably the gold standard in terms of, it's like an 80% effective reduction of hot flashes. Just black cohosh alone, this multi-botanical plus black cohosh, and then the multi-botanical plus soy. I mean, it was just, I don't know how people kept track of this, but when they finally did the analysis, there were no differences. So what is a person to do when and it depends on what month you're reading the chronicle as to whether or not black cohosh works. It doesn't. So what I try and educate my patients is you really have to actually look at who were the patient population. Are they similar to me? Okay, because in some trials, if they're 80-year-old women, that's not going to be as relevant to me. And was it, a high-quality product? I mean, it takes a little bit of effort, but you usually just see the big headline, glucosamine doesn't work. And you don't know, the details about the trial. And so it is hard to keep up with all of this. But let me just show you what the graph was. So remember I said that hormones really worked? This is the number of hot flashes. So look, when they started to take the hormones, sure enough, the hot flashes went down a lot. But every other thing looked about the same. So is it safe? In large clinical trials of almost 3,000 patients, there haven't been a lot of side effects. But you and I both know that if there's a rare side effect, it's not going to show up necessarily in the first 3,000 patients. And that's why when I practice and a new drug comes on the market, especially if it's a new class of medication and everyone's going, oh, please, please prescribe it, I'm one of those that waits 6 to 12 months unless there's a really compelling indication. Because as hundreds of thousands of patients start to take it, then those rarer side effects are going to come to the fore. So I'm what the pharmaceutical firms call a late adapter. And I'm not the person they detail, because I'm not the person, just by virtue of my sort of cautiousness, that's going to be the first person on the block prescribing a medication. Rash and GI upset are the most common. The red flag in the room on this, which is not, a huge red flag, is that there have been cases of like hepatitis or liver inflammation. Here again, we don't know, is this caused by the black cohosh or something else in the patient? So the NIH decided they better check into the safety, and they held a safety conference. And they went back to the quality standards that I've been emphasizing. They said, if you can't find a high-quality product and you take it and it either works or doesn't, that you can't, I mean, if it doesn't work, you don't know if it was because it was a low-quality product. They also said you really do need longer-term studies. They did agree that it didn't appear to be estrogenic, and they couldn't explain. At this time, there were only 4 case reports of this means liver toxicity, but they wanted to be careful. So this would not be a drug I would recommend to somebody with a liver transplant or with acute hepatitis. And let me confuse the waters even more. So I went to Whole Foods and bought 3 different preparations of black cohosh. And look at what we got. This is the remifemin. So yes, the 20 milligrams and the 1 tablet, and what you would have been told is that the dose is 1 twice a day. Well, here on another black cohosh, it's 545 milligrams. And wait a second, what is the calculated to in capsules? I'm not so sure. And on this one, I've now got liquid formulation. I have no idea what I'm taking. So this is why even reading the labels, it's not like with food where you can literally go, okay, this is how much sodium I'm getting. You get the number of milligrams, but you don't know whether these are equivalent in terms of strength. What if somebody didn't want to take this one and shift to this one? How do you even make sense of this? So this is not an easy path to be walking for many people. So just to summarize on black cohosh, it's really been well tolerated by many people, appears somewhat effective in shorter term studies. The good news is there doesn't seem to be a lot of drug-herb interaction. It doesn't appear to be estrogenic. These case reports of hepatitis are a little bit worrisome. And the nice part is that 2 very good friends of mine who are superb researchers have gotten funding from NIH to really look in great detail with a well-designed long-term trial on this. So gosh knows when we'll get the results, but I'm hoping in the next couple of years. Okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit. How many of you have taken echinacea? Do you feel comfortable? Yeah. It's like the number 2 drug. And it's widely used to either prevent or to treat getting an upper respiratory infection. And what's complicated here is that there are 3 different, there's more than 3 different species, but the 3 ones are the ones that are mostly available in these preparations: Echinacea purpurea, angustifolia, and pallida. And the problem is you use the roots on one of them, you use the above the ground plant parts on the other, you use the combination in and it's a tincture or it's a tablet or and you're just going, whoa. In fact, I was at a conference once where these experts, any of you take it and you get a little biting on the tongue when you take it? Well, they were doing like wine tasting for echinacea. They were so skilled at figuring out, okay, and they could tell by the bite on the tongue whether or not it was a high-quality product. And I thought, ooh, you've got better things to do with your life. Okay, because there's so many different forms and preparations, it's made making overall conclusions difficult. You're going to hear in a couple of slides about something called a meta-analysis or systematic review. So let's say I have a bunch of trials that have just 25 or 40 patients in them. That's very difficult to prove statistical significance. But if I had 10 of those and they were all kind of similar, I might be able, with certain kinds of manipulations, to pool the data and come up with a more robust conclusion. Is that making sense? But if you're using 18 different forms and you're using the roots on one and the plant leaves on the other, they're not, it's like comparing apples and oranges. So you can't really do what we would call a systematic review. So here is this systematic review. The Cochrane database, these must be people that just, I'm glad there are statisticians in the world, because I can't understand how people are excited about this, but I'm glad they are. And they actually do huge meta-analyses and systematic reviews of all medicine, but these are particularly talented in doing alternative therapies. And in 9 out of 16 clinical trials, actually the echinacea, those that they could combine that were high quality using similar products, it did look like it was pretty good, or at least partially effective, if you took it on the first day you had symptoms. Now, on average, your symptoms would go away maybe a day or 2 earlier, and people are going, well, that's not that significant. But when you think about the number of people who get colds and the number of days lost from work, it actually makes a difference. In the 3 out of 3 trials that were done to prevent URIs, upper respiratory infections, it was no better than placebo. I still have patients who swear, my daughter got the cold, I take an echinacea, I haven't had a cold in 10 years, I don't care what the data tells me. But the data is stronger for taking it when you first get your symptoms and then treating the cold rather than trying to prevent it. So this was one of the New England Journal, most prestigious medical journal. You're going to notice that most of these prestigious journals will publish many of the negative trials. And that's actually good because there's a publication bias. Some journals only want to publish the things that look sexy and positive. This was a negative trial, and I'm just going to walk you through it. Now, this is not the purpurea. This is the angustifolia, which is a little bit not the most commonly used form. And rhinovirus is the cold virus. So I don't know how they paid these people, but this is what they did. 800 healthy volunteers, and they had to stay in a hotel for a number of days alone. Okay, so they were randomized to get one of 3 different doses of an echinacea preparation or of matched placebos. There were actually 6 different groups, and they stayed in the hotel and they took this. They were fine. Then they volunteered to go like this, and they came around and they injected each one of them in the nose with rhinovirus cultures. Okay, no, this is good because this is going to make it much more clear. You know what it is. Is it, how many of you feel like everybody else around you is sick and you're not, or vice versa? When you're stressed out, you get the cold that somebody 8 miles away has. So they inoculated these folks and then had them continue the echinacea or the placebos and then saw. So was it helpful in preventing or was it helpful in lessening the symptoms? And they did really good outcomes. They did not only the symptoms, but they actually swabbed to make sure that the virus had gotten into the nose. Plus, they checked whether or not there was an antibody reaction. They did it the right way. Now, look, there's no quiz on this, but I just wanted to show you how complicated a study design this was. So they ended up making a 60% extract, a 20%, and all these different formulations, knowing how different things are. And then they matched a placebo for each of them. It was just nuts. So they actually, even though they started out with quite a number of people, there were only about 50 subjects in each group. But the take-home message was it didn't work any better to prevent or to treat the symptoms versus placebo. Now, this is a really interesting criticism because a lot of people who were trained herbalists looked at this and said, you were dumb. You chose a dosing level that we would never give. You're giving 900 milligrams of your dose. We never give less than 3 grams. So I'm not sure why they didn't consult, people who use these things in a traditional way, or whether this is really a valid argument. But there's always somebody who's going to say, the study wasn't well designed, but it actually was pretty well designed. Any questions about echinacea? How many of you really believe it works? Yeah, okay, all right. And it may. Okay, so saw palmetto, and this is a great plant, and this was my star herb for a number of years because A, I thought it worked, and B, it was really, really safe. And it may work, and it still is safe. It's a palm that grows natively in the United States in the Southwest. Actually, not unusual from many of these other herbs known by the Native Americans to be helpful. Widely used in Europe for male urinary problems, particularly what we call BPH, benign prostatic either hyperplasia or hypertrophy. That's where the prostate gets larger with age. And the symptoms, anybody want to know what the symptoms of BPH are? Yeah, we got a woman who's answering. Okay, this is good. Okay, frequency, having to get up and pee a lot more. You've seen those ads on the TV where they're all trying to ride the bike and they don't want to, go on a long trip. What else? Come on. Yes. Yes, so there's less, it's almost like there's this donut that's pressing down on the urine tube. And as it gets bigger, the force of the stream, the volume and the rate at which the urine comes out is less. Other things that are even less nice for people is there can be dribbling afterwards, a sense of incomplete emptying, just a sense you have to go all the time and that you stand forever and it takes a while to go. So there's it's not going to kill anybody, but it's not pleasant for quality of life. And in Germany, they don't go to the prescription medications we give front line. They actually have prescription forms of saw palmetto and some other herbs, and they try that first because they're so sure that they work. And it's a very commonly used herb. So early trials showed that it worked to help not only reduce those symptoms, but when they actually checked the urine flow rates, boy, they were better on the saw palmetto compared with placebo. But again, these were small studies, not a lot of people, not well designed. And it ends up that saw palmetto has a very distinctive smell and taste. And even when it's in a capsule, people really, if they've ever taken it, know that they've got an active ingredient. So this was where a Steve Bent study got published, again in the New England Journal. And this was impressive for several reasons. It had a large number of people. It was a year long. And they used the appropriate dose that's used in traditional care, 160 milligrams of saw palmetto twice a day, and sadly it was no more effective than placebo. So I just show you these graphs to show you how the graphs were. So this is the saw palmetto, and this is the placebo, and this was the symptoms, and sure enough, really no difference across the board with the flow rates. Yeah, have a question? Yeah, that's a great question, because urinary incontinence and dribbling and all of that can happen with women. This is specifically used in men. It's interesting. I'm not sure whether or not it's ever used for women. The mechanism for those symptoms in women is very different from a prostate getting large. Did you have a question? So the question was, have there been studies of it in combination with the things that, such as lycopene, which is from tomatoes, pumpkin seed, there's one called pygeum. There are a number of herbs that appear to be effective. This was just saw palmetto. Because again, you get complicated, because then all you can say at the end of a trial is, well, this product was better or worse. So the patients couldn't, this was what was so great. Steve told me, they spent months getting the manufacturer to create a nasty smelling placebo that looked as nasty. I mean, I don't mean nasty, it really had a strong smell and even taste. And the biggest hint, a well-done clinical trial, at the end will ask a patient, were you getting the real drug or were you getting the sugar pill? And a really well-done trial, it should be 50-50. People should not be able to tell, because that says that they designed a really good placebo. The best part was there were really no difference in adverse events. In fact, the number of adverse events was slightly greater in the placebo group. And the conclusion was no evidence it really works, but no evidence that it's harmful. Boy, so are all those Germans wrong? I don't know. I'm very briefly just going to touch base on garlic and ginseng, and then we're going to talk about resources. And the only reason I'm bringing this up was I felt obliged because it's the #1 herb that's bought in the United States. And it's most widely used, for cardiovascular health, for lowering cholesterol. Some people feel that it has a minimal lowering effect for blood pressure. And earlier studies showed that ingesting of this number of milligrams of freeze-dried herb, which is about equivalent to a half to a clove of raw garlic, was really capable of lowering the cholesterol almost 10%. And this was one of these big systematic reviews. And that's not bad for eating something, having something in a food or taking it in a form that is palatable. But unfortunately, a recent reanalysis of that and some subsequent data says that it's probably more like 4%. But anything to me seems like a plus. And also, because it's part of the Mediterranean diet, usually there are many other health benefits that we don't have time to go into about the Mediterranean diet. So ginseng, I just briefly want to touch base. Used for many, many, many different conditions, and certainly popularized in Asia, but there's actually at least two different species. What we used to call Siberian ginseng is actually a totally different plant. So now is not even allowed to be able to use the word ginseng. So Asian is called Panax ginseng. And remember when Beverly was talking about traditional Chinese medicine and warm and cold herbs and foods, well, Asian ginseng is stimulatory. It's considered hot. It's kind of a, vibrant, increase the energy kind of. Whereas American Panax quinquefolius is considered kind of the chill ginseng. It's got a kind of more even thing. It's not a huge heat. It's a cooling herb. And there's a concept in herbal medicine that we don't have in Western medicine. It's called adaptogens. And ginseng is one of those. And it doesn't make sense to those of us who've been trained in a Western way. But that means that if you're too high in a condition, an adaptogen will bring you into balance. And if you're too low, the same adaptogen will actually bring you into balance via, bringing you up or down. And we don't have a way to understand that, so it's often not mentioned. So, and just to be interesting, American ginseng is virtually extinct now. So now most of the American ginseng is farmed commercially in the upper Midwest. And Daniel Boone made his living as being a ginseng hunter. So all of this, I killed a bar, he was making his money by harvesting American ginseng, which means that it was really, and it's actually more highly prized than many of the Asian ginseng, so that's why it's now commercially made in places like Wisconsin. So the problem is many of the clinical trials with ginseng are in non-English speaking journals. And I think because most of us just look at the English language literature, it doesn't look like it's effective for any one indication. And here again, there are all these small trials for many, many different things: fatigue, athletic performance, sexual performance. And so it's not like with St. John's wort, where most of the trials would focus on a single indication. There was a recent very high-quality meta-analysis where they looked at the English language journals, and they couldn't come up with a positive indication for anything. But I just wanted to say, when pulling up the literature just the last couple of days to prepare, at a conference recently, there was a small pilot study of American ginseng that showed that it might have some effect on cancer-related fatigue. So I want to summarize and then get into resources. I think there actually is some promising data for some herbal therapies, but you have to really step back and look at what's the quality of the research. And even with more money going into it with NCAM and some of the other centers, it's not easy to do good research in this area, and we don't have enough data. Most patients feel that botanicals are safe and because they're natural, and that, I hope, by the end of this lecture you've known is not necessarily true. If something's strong enough to have an effect, it's going to be strong enough to have a bad effect. And always, 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 even if your provider is looking harried and like he or she doesn't have the time, bring them your list of everything you're taking. They may or may not know what's going on, but at least you're opening that conversation. So, Doc, do you think it's safe for me to use this? So how do you personally find a high-quality product? So I'm going to walk you through 3 steps. So, and this is the result of my having done months of research, so I hope you appreciate it. And here, again, is the brands that I normally would never mention. But these are, the reason that I'm mentioning them is that these are high-quality, European-manufactured extracts that have been studied in randomized controlled trials and shown to be effective. So you see those German trials or those, Swiss trials, but then how do you know what's available in this country? Well, these are the brands, at least 1 or 2, that contain a form that has been proven in some other randomized controlled trial to be positive. So this is, sometimes I will say, if you're going to try St. John's wort, and I'm going to give you some other resources to do this, you might want to try, don't have it on here, Kira brand, or if you're going to try milk thistle, try Thistlein, or if you're going to try black cohosh, try Remifemin or that BioNorca product that I mentioned. Now, how many of you are aware of consumerlab.com? Are any of you measure? Good, some of you are members. This, I think, is less than $20 or around $20 a year, and it is a great investment. They are not just interested in echinacea, they're interested in the brand of echinacea. So they buy up specific brands of herbs every couple months, send them to the lab, and then publish on their website the brands that passed and the brands that didn't. Now, it's not saying that echinacea works for your cold, but it is saying, ooh, my brand of echinacea passed at least 1 quality test on a randomized sample. So you're more than welcome to come up afterwards, and I'll show you how it's formatted. But for not much money a year, you have full access to their laboratory results. So that's a really nice thing when you're trying to check out your specific brand. Yeah? Yes, they will, in fact, they often will do their little flashy newsletter and say, ooh. In fact, on the ginsengs, when they did ginseng a couple of years ago, they figured out that almost all of the Siberian ginseng samples had some contaminant, which was an interesting thing. So they try and tell you in an overview, and then they'll specifically say what it was about the product that wasn't acceptable. Okay. And then now there's sort of like a good housekeeping seal of approval. Some of these herb companies are voluntarily subjecting their products to these independent testing things. So the U.S. Pharmacopoeia has a label, and this independently certified also has a label. So if you see either of these, that means they've subjected their product to this kind of quality of manufacturing testing. And then finally, these are some great resources on the web. And I would absolutely suggest that you go to the NCAM website. They have patient-related handouts on many of the modalities, on many of the herbs. You can check and figure out what clinical trials have been funded. It's a very wonderful site. Now, any of you who are real geeks and like to search the medical literature, there is something called Medline, and there is a whole section of Medline which relates to alternative medicine. So, for instance, before when I was preparing, I was just wildly this morning going black cohosh to make sure there was nothing new, and all the recent studies come up. So that's a great resource. Now this, if you have access to a UCSF computer, is free. If you subscribe to it individually, it's about $70 a year, which is more. But let me just show you what comes up when you do. And this is something I use day in and day out when I'm teaching residents in clinic, because often they'll come in and they'll say, ooh, Mrs. Wilson has brought in this, and I have no idea whether this is good. This doesn't talk so much about brands, although there is a product information section. But let's say I'd click on the herbs, St. John's wort would come up. And what will happen is, especially if I take just the medium complexity analysis of it, it'll have dosing, historical use, what's the evidence for whether this works for every indication, what are some resources, what are drug-herb interactions, and it's all like in 2 pages. So I can read it, the resident can read it, and in fact the patient, we often just print it up and give it to the patient. So it's expensive if you don't have access, but if you're close to UCSF and can go to the library, you just put in www.naturalstandard.com. And because UCSF and all the UCs got a site license for this, and it's many of the people like Steve Bent that I talked about and some of our very, very good pharmacy faculty sit and do quality control for these people, and it's really excellent, and I, again, have nothing to do with them. So what happens if you or a family member thinks you might have had a bad reaction to something? I just want to make a case for the fact is that there is a reporting mechanism, and also to encourage you to hold on to a sample of whatever the product is. I actually had a woman who developed some liver inflammation, and she didn't come to me for a couple of weeks, and she was telling me, and she said, you know, I think it was to do because of the product I started to take, but you know that drug company was so nice. I called them up and told them I had a bad reaction, and they sent somebody over and paid me and took it back. Okay, I would do that too. So hold on, you know, if you really think there's something that's related, take a sample, just don't have them buy it back. And you can actually, as a patient or as a practitioner, you can report to this MedWatch program. I mean, MedWatch, you can either just phone it in or go on the website. And then finally, I work at the Osher Center, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about that, but let me just say that we've been talking in a very sort of almost pharmaceutical way about, and herbal medicine lends itself more like pharmaceuticals. You sort of think of it, okay, here it is, I take it. But what the role that herbal medicine plays in my practice is large, but not as large as many of the other things we've talked about in this series. And I just want to encourage you to think of alternative medicine as more than just herbs and acupuncture. Andy Weil, who's the bearded fellow you see on KQED, who runs the University of Arizona program, coined the term integrative medicine. And I think what I value most about my work at the Osher Center is that it really is not saying it's an either or. We practice regular medicine side by side with wonderful practitioners. Dr. Prathakanti, Beverly, Kevin, all of those people are people I have the pleasure of working with. But we try, and not everybody that comes to us gets, here's 5 herbs, here's 6 needles. I mean, we're really trying to look at what's going to be helpful to them. And if something from conventional medicine and the alternative world will come together on behalf of that patient, great. But it's really bringing together the best and not having to rely on just one or the other. And the other thing, this is the best quote I have ever heard, and it's from an MD Scottish homeopath. And he describes integrative medicine as not just having more tools in the toolbox, but about becoming a better craftsperson. So I often, when I lecture the medical students, and I embarrass this one GI surgeon who's presently at UCSF, I don't use her name, and I think the most embodied integrative medicine practitioner is a GI surgeon who works here, who no more knows a whit about acupuncture or herbs. She is just spectacular at being present for a patient, being open, listening, just the kind of physician that I would want. And conversely, I've run into some alternative medicine practitioners who are as not integrative as some people that I work with in conventional medicine. So I would like you to sort of see if you can open your mind, and you've all had the experience of really having, hopefully, a wonderful interaction with a healthcare provider, and I'm sure many of you have had examples of where it hasn't worked so well. So integrative medicine to me is really about training medical students to know less about, okay, the randomized controlled trials showed me this about acupuncture, and more about being able to really deal with patients and their concerns. There was a question? The question is, wait a second, you've just presented a whole series of herbs then, and it looks like the theme is early smaller studies showed they worked. People used them, then we put them into a high-quality randomized controlled trial, and suddenly it's not looking so effective. And how do I come to peace with that? I'm not sure. Actually, I think probably we're underestimating a lot, that medicine's going to be very different in 10 years. I'm going to guess that each of us is a little bit different in how we respond and metabolize certain things we take into our body. And I'm going to guess that in 15, 20 years. We're each going to go around with a little band that's going to say, oh, I am an X14 metabolizer. And I'm going to guess that some people, for the X14 metabolizers, for some people echinacea is perfect, and for others who might, respond to it differently, they may not. So I'm not so sure that we're not going to get to a place where we're going to be much more able to individually suggest classes of both conventional medicines and herbal medicines. But that said, I agree with you. This is pretty sobering stuff, that as you look more and more at randomized controlled trials, there's very rarely the obviously positive study. Now, does that mean that patients aren't being helped by this? I can't say. But it means that if you're really going from an evidence base, it's not looking quite as positive. Yeah. So the question is, what kinds of supplements or vitamins would I recommend for a basically healthy person? And it really depends on whether it's a man or a woman and where they are in their life cycle. I'm the world's worst pill taker, I will tell you. So here I am writing prescriptions and telling people they need to be taking more vitamin D and calcium when they're postmenopausal, and I'm not so good with it myself. But basically, I think there is some good evidence that if you eat a healthy diet, probably a basic multivitamin with at least a little bit of folate is not a bad idea. I'm not very good at taking it myself. I'd rather, with all of these things, that people get them in their natural form in a healthy, complex diet. Certainly postmenopausal women, it's looking more like vitamin D. The doses we thought were sufficient at 400 international units are probably half what they should be. Should be taking closer to 800 international units. And whatever the calcium form that they can tolerate. And beyond that, I honestly don't push a lot. Actually, I take it back. Omega-3 fatty acids. And I would rather they take those, because they've got great anti-inflammatory activity. I would rather they take them in the form of the whole food, which would be cold water fish like salmon, with all the problems with mercury that I know about, or flax seeds. So the one thing I do in the morning is I make a protein powder smoothie, and I throw in raw flax seeds, and I'm happy as I can be. And there's even fish oil that's mercury-free that's a great source. And that's probably one thing that I have recommended for more patients than I would say not. And, coenzyme Q is not something I routinely across the board recommend. Certainly there are people that believe because levels drop with age, and there's a lot of press about how the statin drugs deplete the body of CoQ10. It's an expensive drug. It's used a lot in Japan and elsewhere for everybody who's got heart disease. I think the data is not quite 100% there, enough so that I would make it an across-the-board recommendation. Yes, in the back. Yes, honestly, and if you can take it whole, you'll never have a problem with regularity. I'm serious. You can either grind it up, I throw it whole into the... I just throw in as much as I can tolerate. No, I mean, I don't think you're going to harm yourself with too much. Pardon, I'm up to 3 tablespoons of raw flax seeds into the... And flaxseed oil, this is very interesting. Flaxseed oil, so you can get ground flax seeds at Whole Foods and things, but you need to keep it refrigerated because it can go rancid. The oil, there may be something different about how they process it. So I've just been reading some strange stuff about flaxseed oil. So if you're going to do something that is already prepared, I would actually get the ground seeds and keep it in the refrigerator, or I'd use the whole seeds that don't need to be refrigerated. Put it into salads. You can get a little coffee grinder if you want. I had a dedicated coffee grinder. And the only downside is that if you don't clean it out, it gets really gunky. And my niece, I love her, but she was grinding this stuff up. She's a little bit of a slob. I hope she doesn't see this. And I came back 2 days later after having traveled, and my coffee grinder was completely destroyed because it was like this with the rancid stuff that she hadn't cleaned. So there's just some hints. Yeah. She was mentioning that years back, St. John's wort was actually being touted for colds. There does seem to be some antiviral activity. In fact, in Europe, they were using it in high doses IV for HIV infection. And in fact, one of the recent botanical centers, the University of Iowa and Iowa State, are going to be studying St. John's wort and echinacea for their antiviral properties. So there may be something to that. So yep. Okay, a couple more questions, yeah. So the question was, do we know why these things are so much more popular in Germany? I'm actually not sure why there's much more openness. I mean, like in England, we didn't talk at all about homeopathy, but there are homeopathic hospitals. The royal family use homeopathic remedies, and in this country, it's popular, but not with the extent it is in Europe. I just don't know. Traditionally, it's just been used there for decades. And because they've designed and they've had such high quality manufactured products, I'm really glad that it has been, because those are now available, have been imported into this country. But I can't tell you culturally why that is. But I know from people who've traveled that if they go to a German pharmacy, actually many of the herbs are actually by prescription, because they feel they're so powerful in the forms that they make them that they really should be given with medical advice. Yes. The question is, are there any licensed sort of lay herbalists? I don't actually know whether there are states that have licensing for that. I do know there are a couple of herbal medicine schools that produce, well-trained people. In fact, one of my medical students, just bless her heart, took a year off because she really felt the need to go into deeper. She was a former cook and worked with foods as medicines. And so she spent a whole year at the Berkeley Herbal School and learned to wildcraft all of her own herbs. And her plan is, if she can survive residency, which will be, I'm blessing her as she starts next week, to actually integrate her actual use of lay herbalism along with regular Western herbs that you buy at Whole Foods. So there are some medical students, but the herbalists couldn't, they were like, whoa, what is a medical student doing here? Because the worlds have been so different. But she actually did a lot of teaching of them, and they did a lot of teaching for her. And if she's the model, I'm really encouraged about what kinds of care we're going to have available. Yeah. Okay, so very good question. Wouldn't this be profitable? So it's only profitable. So why aren't all of these herbal companies subjecting their products to testing? Well, first of all, if they don't have to, you have nothing but to lose in one sense. And you can't patent just saw palmetto. That's a plant. But there are herb companies who have patented the specific proprietary formulation. For instance, with ginkgo, if you look on one of the brands that I gave you, it's called EGB 761. It happens to be the Schwabe company's very specific extract, and that can be patented. But there's not a lot of economic incentive for general herbal companies to put, their herb product on the market, and it's unbelievably expensive to do clinical trials well. Walnuts, yay, good. Yes, absolutely. Walnuts are a great source of fiber and omega-3s, especially English walnuts. So when I have a chance to talk to patients, truthfully, if I could get them to move, walk 10 minutes a day or walk 15 minutes a day, and eat a non-garbage diet, as I said, I would be out of business. Thank you, I would be out of business. So I would much rather, instead of taking the omega-3, isolated whatever, eat a fish, eat some flax, eat a healthy diet. I mean, first of all, it's like the studies, many of you may be aware, carrots and colorful vegetables are great for antioxidants. Well, all of those studies where they isolated out the beta carotene and then took it, some of them, it makes cancer worse. It doesn't prevent it. And it's because, in my way of thinking, you're taking something we've gotten used to, and we don't know what all the other ingredients in a whole food are that help balance and synergize that. But we've isolated out and taken at high qualities a single ingredient of this very beautiful, complex, natural food, and we're thinking that that's the only thing that works. And I think we've had a couple of examples where that doesn't work. So if we could get back to the whole food part of this and have you take it in that way, it would be so much better than all the pharmaceuticals. Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. So the question is, do I know the research for phosphatidylserine for memory? So it's one of these complex membrane, complex molecules. And I haven't looked at that literature recently, but it's certainly, when you look at most companies, memory formulas, if they've not just used ginkgo, if they're using things like phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine, and there are a couple of other things, they're there. So unfortunately, I don't know the most recent literature. Yeah, that's a charged question, but a very good one. So the question was, given all of the worries about contaminated pet food and toothpaste and products from China, should everyone just try and avoid it? First of all, it's really difficult to know whether the ingredient of the product you're eating, what the sourcing is. I think that was actually part of why this took so long to unfold. I just think you have to be cautious, and it's very difficult. I don't know that boycotting absolutely everything, even if I did know what came from there, because there are some people that don't do good work, and there are people that are going to import just high quality products. So that's where having access to somebody who's done a little bit of research, and like with Beverly, when she knows which herbs that she would feel trusting to give to a patient, rather than go down to a pharmacy in some place and just pick stuff up out of the bin. That's where expert opinion would really be helpful. So I'd be happy to stay up here. I just really want to thank you again for your amazing attention through this entire thing. Thank you very much.